Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, Fostering Arts Health Research Partnerships at the Community Level, a how-to guide. This is Sunil Iyengar, the Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. Before diving in, let me take you through a few housekeeping items for the webinar itself. You are all muted and will be able only to hear us. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. We expect there to be about this 1 hour to be taken up with pretty much half presentation, half Q&A. Throughout this webinar, you can submit questions or comments at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible or comments as possible during the time we have. Please do not use the raise hand button. This webinar will be posted on our website in the podcasts, webcasts, and webinars section of our website in a few days, so you can refer to it in the future. So welcome again, and we're very delighted to get to this point. Today, I'll be introducing Jeff Chaplin and Julene Johnson, who are co-authors of a report, or really a guide, that we issued last December. We took the greater part of last year in developing it, and I'll explain a little bit about how it came about in just a moment. But first, I want to give you some in broad strokes, some research updates that have to do with the arts and health. So we have a few things here, and I thought that those of you who are interested can click on these links and read about these items later, but I just want to touch on them briefly. And I just want to bring to your attention that the National Endowment for the Arts, obviously through its grant making, does a lot of work that touches on health. But here, what I've attempted to show are some of the things that are research specific that relate to the NEA's activities in the arts and health. So the first item, most recently, just last week, in fact, the NEA announced expansion of its Military Healing Arts Network. The program itself is called Creative Forces, which is the NEA Military Healing Arts Network. And among other things, this included the addition of 4 new clinical sites for this program, and also a community element being integrated into it. And it's really about the role of the arts in helping to heal the signature wounds of our recent wars. But I will say that as part of the initiative, we also made a renewed commitment to research, and in particular, our office, the NEA's Office of Research and Analysis, working closely with Bill O'Brien at the NEA, who's handling the overall initiative. So we're very proud to help in that capacity. Number 2, also around December, or a little earlier than that, we released a new research agenda for the NEA, a 5-year research agenda, which is available on our website at this link here. And that also includes some items that relate specifically to the arts' relationship to health and well-being. For example, later this year, not too long from now, actually, we expect to release a report relating to older adults' health and well-being in relation to their arts participation rates. Number 3, sort of in service of our research agenda, we've established a new program called the NEA Research Labs. And just a few months ago, we announced the award to 2 out of 4 of the new research labs that will specifically study the arts relationship to social and emotional health and well-being. Again, this link is here, and you'll have these slides later to refer to get back to this link. Number 4, just to be mindful for those of you researchers here, or those of you who work with researchers, and that's what today's all about, to talk about research and practitioner relationships and collaborative opportunities. Just to say that the NEA Research Artworks Grants Program supports quite a few arts and health projects. And we also require, in the terms of our grant, for the researchers to submit a working paper or a journal article that then appears on our website. And finally, bringing this closer to what we're talking about today, the NEA, if many of you know, and many of you are on our mailing lists the NEA runs an interagency task force consisting currently of about 18 federal agencies, departments, or units within the federal government that are concerned with understanding how the arts may connect with health and well-being, but also with educational outcomes later in life. And the goal is to really understand points of convergence for research and practice across the lifespan between the arts and some of these other agencies' missions and goals. So practical terms, I will say that a really great partner in this task force has been the National Institutes of Health, and we're pleased to say that recently it was announced that NIH is teaming up with the Kennedy Center for a partnership called the Sound Health Initiative, which will focus on understanding music and the brain and healing through research. And one of the first milestones is an event that will be held June 2nd and 3rd at the Kennedy Center around this research. So we're very pleased to be associated with these groups. So now I'm going to go into introducing our speakers. And the reason I wanted to bring to your attention this whole concept of the Interagency Task Force on the Arts and Human Development is one of the very first things that this group decided when we met, and we meet once a quarter. Again, that's about 18 or so federal agencies and department representatives. We meet and we discuss opportunities for collaboration, but we also discuss things that are going on in our own portfolios that may warrant their attention and warrant mutual attention and understanding, so we can work effectively to fill these knowledge gaps. Well, as part of that, one of the very first things that the group identified as a need was some kind of guide or manual or sort of a how-to playbook for arts practitioners on the one hand, community-based arts practitioners, and on the other hand, researchers who largely are academic-based, including, of course, consultants in the private sector, but specifically there are some unique concerns related to academic-based research on health or on well-being or on some of the other community-based kinds of outcomes that the arts are integral in and that we are interested in studying together. So we want to build capacity and to enable these partnerships to occur more fluidly. And one step was to team up with both Julene and Jeff today, who we'll be introducing today, who prepared this guide that we'll be discussing. And it's really a how-to guide in every sense. And I won't talk too much about it because I want you to hear from them. But let me just introduce them. One of the authors, of course, is Jeffrey Chaplin, who's the founder of New Art Horizons, which is a Bay Area consultancy advising organizations that serve special communities. One of the things he's done is he's pioneered the first year-round multi-generational visual and performing arts program in San Francisco, known as the Center for Elders and Youth in the Arts. The other author is Julene Johnson, who's a professor and associate director at the University of California, San Francisco, specifically within their Institute for Health and Aging. She's also on the faculty in the UCSF Center for Aging in Diverse Communities. And what's interesting, I think, how we got to know Julene, incidentally, is through her work in cognitive neuroscience. And specifically, she runs a study of choral singers, older adults singing in choral singing communities, and what the health and well-being implications might be. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jeff and Julene, and please feel free to submit questions in the box at any time, and we will make all due attempt to answer them after the presentation. Thank you. So Julene or Jeff? Oh, sorry, you may be, one of our speakers may be muted. Could you unmute yourselves, please?
This is Jeff. Julene has the first part of the presentation. And I just lost my screen.
Stan, we will be right back with you. We're just having a moment of technical difficulty. Just one more minute. We're working out a sound issue. Thanks, everyone.
Being in the arts, of course, we rehearse and rehearse, but nevertheless, we can't foresee every contingency. Just stay on hold if you could. Thank you so much. We'll be right back with you. Jeff, maybe you could start us off. Is that okay until Julene gets on?
Yes, I'll do my best for that. Well, first, thank you for having me here, and it was a real pleasure in putting together this guide and working with Dr. Johnson at UCSF. Let's see, the goals of the guide were to bring together the...
Hello, this is Julene.
Oh, Julene, I was
here we
just...
go. Maybe.
Sorry, I had to
Go
call
ahead.
on my cell phone. I don't know what... Okay, so should I take over, Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. Yes, so in terms of the overview of our talk today, what we'd like to do is first go over the goals of the guide that we prepared. Also thinking about the background preparations that we did to actually write the guide. And then for the remaining part of the talk, we'll talk specifically about the highlights of the guide. Of course, we can't go into all the details, but we'll give you the highlights of it. So just to let you know, the goals of this project in writing the guide were to facilitate the expansion and advancement of research on arts and health. And it was really designed to equally serve arts professionals and biomedical researchers and behavioral researchers. And this is, and if somebody could forward the next slide, I'm having an internet issue apparently.
I've just done that, Julene. Don't worry about it.
So could somebody, yeah.
So the intended
I
audience?
the slide.
Okay. So the intended audience, when we think about who we were writing for the guides, the intended audience were arts professionals, and we broadly defined this, both as practicing community visual and performing artists, arts administrators, designers, and arts therapists, and also the associated organization and community collaborators that might be involved. And also we intended this guide to be useful to both, and also to biomedical and behavioral researchers, including academic centers, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, or even those in private research firms. So I will now turn it over to Jeff, who will talk about the background preparations.
Thanks, Julene. As a part of background preparations for the guide, we did a terrain check of existing literature to identify examples of research and arts programs with a vested interest in health outcomes. This included a check to determine what bibliographical and/or online resources currently exist that might be useful in guiding research into arts and health. We searched for current researcher and arts professional partnerships and compiled a list of research projects that focus on examining the impact of the arts on health. We searched for projects from 2005 to present. We compiled a list of arts programs and academic centers that have a vested interest in or are involved in measuring health outcomes. For each arts program, we collected information about arts media, the location of the arts program, the population served, as well as other information. The terrain check had a focus on U.S. projects and programs, including arts therapy organizations. We identified 42 arts programs and arts and health research programs representing a variety of arts media, age ranges, and clinical populations. In addition, we held one-hour interviews with 11 experts in the field, both arts professionals and researchers, to help inform what might be needed or desired in an arts research guide from their point of view. Julene?
Yes, so for the next slide, if somebody could forward it for me. This slide shows the overall organization of the guide. So we have an introduction. We talk about the historical context and defining what we call the research continuum. There's a section on research into the arts and health, and specifically talking about in detail relevant research methods. There's a big section on partnerships and what those partnerships benefits might be and how to create those partnerships. Also, there's a section specifically for arts professionals thinking about their own programs and wondering, trying to determine whether or not they would be research ready. And then also we provide very specific steps into how one might develop an arts and health research study. And the final chapter in the guide focuses on funding. But on the next slide, you'll see that for today, what we'll do is just focus on the areas that are highlighted in kind of this orange-red color. So on the next slide, let's start with research into the arts and health. So research into the arts and health typically uses the scientific method. And the scientific method is used to explain, predict, and also understand phenomena. And within this context, a variety of research methods can be used to gain knowledge about the effects of the arts on health and well-being. And specifically for the guide, we focused in on one type of model that we felt was particularly relevant for arts and health research. And this is called community-engaged research. And community-engaged research is an approach for conducting research that brings community stakeholders together, including arts professionals, into this research process alongside researchers. And the nice thing about the community-engaged research model is that it acknowledges differences in perspectives and also brings experiences and expertise to the shared goal of making scientific discoveries related to arts and health. So next slide. So why did Jeff and I think that community-engaged research was a good model? Well, several reasons, and I list just 3 here, and I encourage you to go to the guide to read some additional reasons for why we selected community-engaged research as a guide. But first of all, we feel that it facilitates research topics that are relevant to a community, and without stating the obvious, of course, arts programs do take place in communities, and a community-engaged approach to research is therefore relevant. Community-engaged research also often involves interprofessional partnerships, and as I mentioned earlier, they acknowledge the different perspectives of arts professionals and researchers and bring them to the table with a shared goal of thinking about the impact of the arts on health. And another reason why community-engaged research is good is it often includes understudied and underrepresented populations, which are particularly relevant to arts and health research. So the next slide. So in the guide, you will see a lot of text dedicated to talking about the different research methods that are relevant to arts and health. And research into the arts and health can take many forms, and appropriate scientific research designs are essential in order to reach valid conclusions to the research questions that we might have. And I broadly define in the guide, we broadly define 2 main areas of research methods, what we call qualitative and quantitative research methods. And fundamentally, the research methods that are selected should be dictated by the research questions that are desired to be answered. So if we flip to the next slide, and then again, this is very brief in the presentation. I encourage everybody to go to the guide to get much more information on these very unique research approaches. So for qualitative research, this approach uses an in-depth approach to gather information about the lived experience. And qualitative research methods are particularly useful for gathering information about a new topic in order to develop theories. So qualitative research often is done in the earlier stages of research. And the types of methods that are used are, for example, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, direct participant observation. And this can happen and occur in both individual or group settings. And the analysis of qualitative research often is done by analyzing the interviews and the participant observations. And as one example, for example, we might be interested in better understanding the feasibility of a dance intervention for persons with Alzheimer's disease and their caregivers. We might decide that because there's not a lot of research in this area, that a focus group might be of interest and useful. So we would, for example, invite a number of persons with Alzheimer's disease and their caregivers to attend a focus group and ask targeted questions that would help us understand feasibility. We could ask questions about the perceived benefits and also acceptability. So lots of different things. And this could be done with lots of different populations, such as at-risk youth or other ages too. The next slide talks about quantitative research, which puts an emphasis on what we call objective measurement and often uses statistical analyses of data. And in quantitative research, specific research questions are developed, also hypotheses about the the nature of those relationships between variables, and theoretical models are often heavily used in quantitative research. And in this method, data are collected using instruments such as surveys and other research tools like brain imaging or biomarkers. These instruments are collected in what we hope are an objective way, and we take several approaches to making sure that objectivity is maintained in quantitative research. And some examples of quantitative research methods includes, for example, experimental, where we're interested in studying the cause and effect. And as an example, one of the studies that I'm leading, the Community of Voices study, we are using what we call a cluster randomized design with 12 senior centers, where the senior center sites get randomized to either start acquire intervention immediately or after 6 months. And we currently have about 490 individuals in that study. A quasi-experimental method is another type of quantitative method, and it shares some similarities with the experimental research, but it lacks this random assignment. And these are often done in settings in which it's difficult to randomize individuals or groups of individuals. So this is another approach to doing quantitative research. And finally, another type of quantitative research method is what we call observational or descriptive. For example, if we wanted to understand if the students in a high school band or choir program classes how might they rate their self-esteem, and do they differ depending on what type of classes they're in, and also do they differ compared to other folks who are not in the music classes, as another example. Mixed methods is another approach to quantitative research that would take the best, or could take approaches both of qualitative, for example, using focus groups or interviews, and quantitative. So sometimes the research questions are better answered using both types of approaches. But again, it really depends on the type of research question you're asking and what method would be best. Okay, so for the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to talk about partnerships.
Okay, let's move to the partnership slide. Arts professionals are experts in the practice of their art forms. Researchers are experts in the practice of research. This may seem obvious, but it's important to stress the different but complementary types of knowledge, skills, and experiences that each bring. Depending on the settings in which they practice, arts professionals may have a wealth of experience engaging individuals in the arts to improve health conditions. Although the results might not be supported by research evidence, such professionals often witness firsthand the effects of their artistic practice on individuals, on groups, and on entire communities. Because they are experts in their field, arts professionals likely will have insights into what types of art programs or interventions work best in which settings and for whom. This knowledge can be invaluable in helping to shape research questions, to design research studies, and to communicate with the population being studied, and to interpret research results. Another benefit of partnering with arts professionals can be to expand the scope of the research, the diversity of people involved, and the breadth of topics that can be studied. Arts professionals also have a practical knowledge of the communities or settings in which they work, which can facilitate the development of research questions that are relevant to all parties. Researchers already involved in research about health can be a good resource for identifying which health issues and conditions need attention and how the arts might be applied to help solve those problems. Researchers are skilled in conducting literature searches to determine what already has been done and then pinpointing knowledge gaps. Researchers may also be helpful in identifying which components of an arts program are the most essential to study and which indeed may be the most plausible to study. Most importantly, because good research builds on prior research results, concepts, and peer review, the importance of using a sound scientific foundation to help propel discovery in the arts and health sector is critical. Partnering with researchers can help ensure development of studies that maintain high rigor and have the potential for reproducibility. Research results then become foundational for future research, and they also may lead arts professionals to new sources of funding. And then the next slide. The Guide to Community Engaged Research in the Arts and Health has information on creating partnerships and suggestions on locating arts professionals and researchers who have a twofold interest in the arts and health. The guide has links to resources and organizations that can be helpful in finding and establishing partners, including local and state arts agencies, local community arts organizations, and local and state arts and health alliances. The guide discusses the challenges in partnering and provides suggestions on how to prevent problems or overcome some of the typical challenges. The guide discusses training models that can help arts professionals and researchers establish and maintain partnerships. One model that we felt was particularly adaptable for this purpose is the Interprofessional Education, or IPE, training model. IPE is intended for professionals from different disciplines who, in partnership with others, have a goal of improving health. IPE helps partners become knowledgeable about and to respect the competence that each partner brings to the effort, and helps partners incorporate checks and balances that can help to maintain the partnership and bring success to the research endeavor. Next slide, please. This illustration is an example of an interprofessional training model adapted for a three-way partnership between an arts organization, a research organization, and a community program setting, probably housed by another organization. The training would include having teams participate in training modules that are designed for the partnership. Standard training modules would include topics like understanding teams and perspectives, knowledge of roles and responsibilities, establishing clear channels of communication, conflict management, and working in a continuous learning environment. The guide provides links to resources like the IPE model that can help you in establishing a training program that suits the design of your particular research partnership. Next slide, please. Is your arts program a potential health intervention? Are you research ready? How can you assess your program and take steps to prepare for a research partnership? Arts-related research can make a useful contribution to a broad array of contemporary health challenges. This may include understanding the social determinants of health for vulnerable and traditionally underserved communities, or studying the arts' effect on people within the U.S. correctional system. Other examples are to investigate the arts' role in addressing depression, socialization, or loneliness in older adults, or to explore how the arts might improve recovery times and reduce hospital stays. Further research might be able to track the arts' efforts in addressing health disparities through arts-based community educational programs that foster healthcare literacy. Deciding where your program might fit in is important. Documentation and collecting basic data is the first step in preparing for research, whether you are involved in a research partnership currently or not. Many arts programs already have a documentation process in place to help monitor program effectiveness and keep information about who is involved. It is important to begin the process of documentation by developing training manuals and procedure guides. This measure will help to ensure consistent quality and to avoid program creep. Such documentation is a prerequisite to designing and implementing research studies. Another step in documenting an arts program is to think broadly about whom the arts program serves and the parameters in which the program is delivered. Identifying the most important benefits you would like to assess would be the next step. And Julene will take the next slide.
Yes, so the next couple of slides actually give a very concrete example of how an arts program might go about documenting their program and thinking about measuring the health outcomes related to their arts intervention. So just as an example, again, this is outlined in the guide. Let's just imagine we have a dance intervention, and the first thing that is helpful for folks to do is to think about what are the major components that are involved in dance that might have a measurable impact on health and well-being. And just, with the check marks here, we looked thinking that dance involves, if it was group dance, a social setting. Of course, there is emotional reactions in a dance intervention, but maybe this is not one of the primary components in this example. Also, dance involves physical function and cognition. And in the next column, you can see where we provided some specific examples of how dance might be social, such as, for example, making new friends, or how dance might be physical, such as moving to the rhythm of music. So on the next slide, after thinking about the components that are pivotal in this intervention, we might next think about the mechanisms by which the components act. So for example, for social, we know that they make new friends, but how does this happen? Well, there might be an increase in social support, there might be decreased feelings of loneliness in a group setting, and also an increased sense of belonging. And also with the example of physical, you might see improved balance in dance, also strengthening the core muscles and improved flexibility. So for each of these major components in the arts intervention, think about what are the things that might happen, what are the mechanisms by which the dance might have an effect on health and well-being. And then the next step, in the next slide, would be now to think about specifically what can you measure related to dance and related to the outcome measures of these components. So for physical function, we could, for example, measure balance and lower body strength, and then thinking about specific outcome measures. And this is where a researcher and a relationship with researchers can be very helpful, because they are very familiar with thinking about taking a component, thinking about the mechanisms of action, and then developing and selecting outcome measures that will specifically think about measuring that aspect of your arts intervention. And then in the next slide. Okay, so for the very last part of the presentation today, wanted to talk about in the guide the tools that we have for developing an arts and health research study. And in the next slide, what you'll see is a checklist that Jeff and I, actually before that, thinking about the arts and health study in a macro level. The first step is to identify that arts intervention. Back one slide, please. The first step, identifying the arts program that you're interested in researching, develop that research study, including the research questions, carry out the research study itself, and then disseminate the results. So this is the macro view of how an arts and health study might happen. And then in the next slide, in the guide, Jeff and I developed a checklist of what we think are the important aspects for how one would develop an arts and health research study. And this hopefully can help facilitate the steps that need to happen in a very concrete way. For example, the first step is developing your research questions, completing a literature review, reviewing the community best practices. So for example, what's already being done in the community, what community arts professionals think work, and how can we think about that in the context of the research study. Also developing specific research hypotheses and theoretical models if appropriate. Selecting the research design and methods, for example, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, those decisions are important pretty early. Identifying the study population, are they at-risk youth, or are they young adults, older adults? What is the study population? Conducting a power analysis if it's necessary. This is done often with quantitative studies, and selecting the appropriate outcome measures, such in the example that I gave in the last few slides. And then establishing the study procedures, the data collection, and data analysis plans. All of this has to be documented carefully. And in addition, applying for human subjects research approval from an institutional review board. Usually this is done at a university, and important for obtaining approval to carry out the human subjects research project. And also consider safeguards for vulnerable populations, developing a detailed budget, and partnership agreements, and then also designing a dissemination strategy. So you can see how the the research study has a life of its own. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And an important part, of course, is disseminating the research results back to the community. So with that, on the next slide is our picture of the guide again with a link to a free guide that you can download from the National Endowment for the Arts website. And I will turn it back over to Sunil.
Thank you, Jeff and Julene. Thank you very much. And thanks to our people who are on the webinar for bearing with us as we had a quick technical issue at the beginning. Just wanted to say that there is a here's just another slide to show you that again, this is this project originated with this interagency task force on the arts and human development. Here's a link to it, and there's a lot of good stuff on that web page, including as it turns out, a list of federal funders in research on the arts and health, and we've tried to ourselves curate a list with the help of our members. And so some of the section on funding in that guide that Julene and Jeff are talking about relates back to this list and some of the other agencies that are interested in this kind of research. And you'll be surprised, in fact, that it's not only health-based agencies or the NEA that care about this kind of research. It really does cut across many different divisions of many different departments and agencies. So with that, I'll invite you again, to those of you in the audience, so to speak, to submit any questions you have. We have some questions already. I wanted to just also note that part of the rationale for this guide, as I explained, it came out of this group, but part of it was some of these funding agencies had noted that particularly when arts organizations or arts practitioners submitted research proposals in a particular domain, say the National Institute of Health, when they're looking at issues related to, say, well-being and culture, culture's relationship to well-being, or some other domain like that. They've noticed that they felt that as a field that those applications could have been more competitive. And so really our hope here is with the guide to just start the ball rolling and helping to really helping all of us to kind of raise up the ante in learning how to not only write successful proposals that may be eligible for these kinds of funding programs, but also to identify the right partners to work with us in issues related to the arts and health, specifically in research. So we hope this guide goes some distance toward that. So with that, I'm going to start with a question to you both. I was wondering, one could say that, Julene and Jeff, a lot of the elements you described are probably common to any basic kind of research guide, irrespective of the domain, right? Like the distinction between qualitative and quantitative, some of the elements of designing a study, that sort of thing. And I guess I'd love to hear, and I think this gets through very well in the guide itself and in some of the slides you showed and in the presentation, but if you could reiterate what you think was unique in working on this project. What were some unique factors that you would say are more cogent for, say, arts-related projects that may not appear in your standard how-to research guide, if that makes sense?
Yes, should I start? This is Julene. I think the one unique thing about especially the approach that we're taking of the guide is the importance of the community in the research. Traditionally, researchers will sit in their kind of ivory towers in their laboratories at universities and invite these highly specialized research participants to participate in research, and rarely, at least in general, rarely do they communicate and work with the community to do the research. And for me, the important part in thinking about arts professionals and arts programs is that because they exist within the community, it's very important to think about doing the research within a community context. So that was something that was a slight shift in the approach that I traditionally have taken with research, which is to do it more in a laboratory-based setting.
Yes, and I would agree with that. And another tag along would be the potential intimidation factor for artists who work in the community to work with academic researchers. because of these types of barriers that exist. And so I think what the guide does is help bridge that gap between these two unique disciplines, and and enables them to work together, because for artists in the community, for the most part, unless they're researchers themselves, this is a whole new field with very critical and independent variables that need to be worked out, that they training on, and if they would like to get involved, sometimes they're intimidated by just the nature of the background of what's needed, and what researchers can in fact bring to the project.
Thank you, Jeff. Jolene, can I ask you, just sort of anecdotally, coming at it from, and I know you have a passion and interest in the arts, but coming at it from your perspective as a cognitive neuroscientist doing research here and abroad, what have you learned from working with arts practitioners? That is to say, for example, the program you're in terms of working with choral singers and an older adult community there in San Francisco. What has rubbed off on you as a researcher from working with arts practitioners?
Well, I think the thing that is really important to me is learning about the experiences of the arts from the arts professionals. And I mean, I'm fortunate myself to have a degree in music, and I've studied music, and I've worked with patients with regards to, music, et cetera, like in music therapy settings. But my job doesn't allow me to have that deep understanding about how the arts work, and the range of experiences that can occur with the arts, and how might we be able to study those aspects of the arts. So for me, it's really a learning experience, and being able to listen and learn about the depth of the knowledge of arts professionals who are working in the field and are doing their art, not to sound trite, but so I would say it's an educational opportunity.
Thank you. So in the vein of listening and learning, I'm going to get off the floor, so to speak, and defer now to the questions we've got rolling in. Here's a question. The person writes, I'm working on a dissertation for research on the utility of outsider art in conflict transformation in low and middle income countries, South Africa in my case, as a cost-effective community-oriented intervention. I'm curious, what are some of the variables or factors asked to the participants or stakeholders of your mixed method community engaged research? Thank you. So I think if we can just broaden the question a bit, in terms of community, the one strategy you described, which is very specific, community engaged research, where you engage the community at all levels. What kinds of variables or factors did you ask of your participants or stakeholders in terms of that may have gotten into the research?
Jeff, do you want to take a stab at that one?
I thought that would be for you, Julie.
Well, I have to give just an anecdote. It's interesting that in the research project that I have funded currently by the National Institute on Aging, the second aim was contributed by one of the directors of the senior centers. And what I was doing was going around and talking with each of the senior centers that I was interested in involving in my study, and asking them what are the facilitators and barriers to the study, but also what type of a choir program would be appropriate for that setting. And one of the senior center directors said, well, you have to study cost effectiveness, because we are constantly having to argue that not only are the programs helpful and have an evidence base, but is it cost effective to do? So these are the type of things that came up that I would have never predicted in the conversations that happen with community stakeholders. So I don't know if that quite answered your question, but I think it's for me, it was like a listening tour. I was interested in learning about how an arts intervention could work in that setting, what were the things that they were interested in, and how could we then design a research study that would acknowledge and respect some of the needs in their community.
Great, thank you, Jolene. And also this next comment or question is I think, an important one. It says that the report uses the term arts and health in contrast to arts in health, such as creative arts therapists working at bedside with patients. The distinction in terms was intentional, correct? Thank you. That's the question. And I'll just comment on that. From our perspective, we did go back and forth in various ways, and we did settle on arts and health. And as I'd love for maybe one of the speakers to explain, we did attempt to be comprehensive, realizing there are very unique concerns and implications related to creative arts therapists. So we, for the purpose of this guide, I think spoke about them as arts practitioners among several types of arts practitioners, recognizing that they have their own standards for certification and their own lineage of research, et cetera. But can someone maybe improve upon that answer, please?
Yeah, so Sunil, we actually have we have some text written about that decision on page 1 of our guide in the introduction. And as Sunil said, we went back and forth about how are we going to frame this very large topic. And I think we decided that arts and health was more broad than arts and healing. And of course, arts and health encompasses arts and medicine and arts and healing programs. So I think we were looking for a term that was the broadest as possible to include in this topic, but also acknowledge both the arts in healthcare settings, the arts in communities, the arts in different contexts that were not just therapeutic arts, for example, in healthcare.
Yeah, I would also add that, that one thing I feel good about the guide doing is defining terms very well, I feel. So there was a great attempt to explain what we mean when we say arts in practice or the term as it may be. And evaluation too was something we talk about briefly, how we even make a distinction between most kinds of research and evaluation of a specific program and talk about some overlap there as well. So here's a really good question. As a producing arts organization, is it possible to adapt existing programs, arts programs, to fit opportunities for research, or is it best for research to be integrated into the creation of new programs?
I think it's a little bit of both. This is Jeff. And I mean, whatever program, if you have a program currently at work, I mean, the guide is going to be very helpful to guide you into where you are in terms of being able to even engage in research, which is highly dependent on the research question that you want to ask, particularly what benefits your program might have in terms of impacts on health. That's where the question would orient from. And then let's say a research project took place and you obtained some answers after the research was executed. Then you also could remodel or adjust a program to better fit what your discovery is, as a result of the research. I hope that makes sense. Julie?
Yes, absolutely, Jeff. I concur with what you said. And I think in the process of documenting the program, oftentimes in research you have the opportunity to think about community best practices, but also look into the research literature and what has already been done. And a good example that I use, again, was the choir program that we developed for the Community of Voices research study, was not your typical sing-along choir experience that's the stereotypic experience for older adults. We really took research findings about thinking about multimodal interventions, and we combined that with community best practices to develop a choir program that was much more engaging than a typical, for example, sing-along. Not that they're bad, but we were very interested in the impact on health and know from the literature that it has to be more engaging to get those sorts of effects, potentially. So maybe that's another example, kind of a concrete example, how it takes an existing program but also has the benefit of thinking about research that's already been done.
Yes, thank you. Here's a question. As you know, it is more difficult to conduct randomized controlled trials of arts-based interventions for health and well-being. You see the medical community becoming more flexible or accepting of mixed methods and qualitative approaches to assessing effectiveness of arts interventions? Another fabulous question. Julene or Jeff?
Absolutely. I think, yes, it is a little more challenging to do randomized controlled trials of any type of behavioral interventions, not just the arts. But I do think that there are different types of randomized controlled trials methods that can be considered. And for example, I'm using a cluster randomized control design in my study where the clusters are the senior center sites. So we're not randomizing individuals. And of course, it's not double blind. The people who are singing know that they're singing, and and it's not like the very strict type of randomized control trial. But I would encourage people to think a little bit outside the box and look at some of these other types of randomized control trial designs that might be a better fit for arts and health research. But also look into the behavioral sciences, because I think they're struggling with some of the same things that the arts and health field also struggles with.
Yeah, struggle is right. I mean, we really try to balance that as well. The imperative for that kind of experimental studies, those kinds of experimental studies that have some counterfactual element, which can be very hard to do in an arts education or arts setting, but still try to also be sort of realize that the best, if we can truly and with fidelity show the mechanism of action through qualitative research, if we can have solid descriptive statistics that then can be used to come up with statistical models to derive correlations that are that look to be tight or strong, that can go a long way too. And sometimes in terms of public awareness, I would also say that it really depends on the audience, because sometimes for certain policy decisions, you don't need to have what they call the gold standard in health in terms of randomized controlled trials to show that there's some impact or that there's some benefit from, say, the arts. But in other policy contexts, yes, they do seem to want that. And we would hope that the medical community as well, and I think, as you said, Julene, I think through the behavioral side especially, that there's some flexibility there in realizing the multimodal aspect of the arts and how similarly you're going to want to have multivariate kinds of tools, if you will, to understand sort of a more holistic measurement of the arts benefits. Here's a comment. I know the guide focused on methods for research and references to program evaluation and impact assessment were provided. However, can you comment on the intersection of program evaluation with the approaches and methods you presented today? In particular, I'm looking at in situ tools for audience impact as part of program evaluation. Any comments are welcome. Julene or Jeff, do you mind if I just say maybe a few words and then you could certainly, if you have anything you'd like to bring to our attention, that'd be wonderful. I felt like this was an important question from one perspective, because a lot of the work that we do here at the NEA actually is not only about research that's conducted in sort of in community settings or in academic research settings, but in fact, a lot of it has to do with program evaluation and what we do to understand the mechanics of a program that we're running at the endowment or in collaboration with our partners with other organizations. And oftentimes we're forced to kind of look at novel and innovative measurement tools. I mean, I would love to be able to have a go-to toolbox or some place where I could say, well, we don't need to keep inventing new metrics or new research questions or survey items because, we have the perfect, if you will, toolkit that captures everything we want to ask about the arts in our program evaluations. But each program evaluation is so unique and has with it very different research questions that we often are in a place of looking to research for program evaluation methods. And a good example, I'll give you two brief examples. One is this audience impact piece that's referred to here by the questioner. We've looked at things like intrinsic impact and sort of affect related to audiences in arts settings, and cognitive affect as well as emotional. And a lot of that relies on the psychology research field, and yet we've tried to tailor it to some extent to see how that could work as an evaluation strategy. It hasn't always worked, but we've piloted work like that. And I can think of other things that come to mind here. But does anyone have a comment to make about this crossover between research and evaluation, and particularly, again, the questioner wanted to know, given the methods that you discussed today, where do you see some potential impact through evaluation.
Yes, and so also on page 2 of the guide, we talk about this in a little bit more depth, but I would say, the distinction, although there's a lot of overlaps between program evaluation and research, I would say that the scientific research really, the goal is to discover new knowledge and facts, and then also to improve our understanding of a phenomenon, so it can be generalized to a larger population. So there's the discovery and there's the generalization to a larger population. Oftentimes in the program evaluation approach, the goal is to gather information to make decisions and to think about whether or not a program is worth continuing or not, or make modifications to the program, etc. And they generally don't generalize, or typically don't generalize to the broader population. So although these distinctions are, on paper very clear, in reality there's a lot of overlap. And I think there's approaches from both the scientific method approach and the program evaluation approach to the arts. Both of these are needed and not mutually exclusive. So I think fundamentally the question has to be, what is the research question? Are you interested in discovering new knowledge and generalizing to a larger population, or are you interested in better understanding an arts program and the impact of that arts program at a certain location, for example, and tweaking it? So backing it up to what exactly is the information that you want to gain will help dictate whether you decide to do scientific research versus a program evaluation.
Thank you very much, Julene and Jeff. And I wanted to tell everyone again, thank you for tuning in. We will receive any further questions at this address here on your website. If you have any questions we're unable to ask, we'll do our best to answer them. And I think Julene and Jeff wouldn't mind, if I can put words in your mouth, wouldn't mind us forwarding any questions to you that may be of interest. Also, again, to remind you to, if you'd like to sign up for future opportunities like this, please go ahead at this email address. And we do hope the guide is useful to folks. We'd encourage you to distribute it and send the word out. We do have hard copies as well as at the NEA. So if you contact us and you want hard copies distributed for free, we can send those to you in addition to any online electronic copies. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.